Japanese and American miscommunication in the Pacific.
The Japanese-American War in the Pacific was heavily influenced by miscommunication. The Battle of Midway is a prime example of that. It was an uncoordinated attack due to incorrect data and large technological discrepancies. The Americans had modern radar detection systems while the Japanese relied solely on scout planes, who were often inaccurate. These inaccuracies caused a devastating failure in the Japanese' effort to capture the island, which would have given them an important advantage and put the Americans on the defensive. This shows how crucial communication is in battle and how it can affect not only a battle, but also an entire war.
Japan lacked raw natural resources in their country like oil and rubber. Places like Indonesia had plenty of resources for them to conquer. However, the Philippines stood in their way. At the time, it was an American territory just a mile north of Indonesia.
Because of Japan's lack of resources, they couldn't afford to manufacture new equipment in case of conflict with the Americans.
Japan planned a surprise attack on them in hope to weaken their navy and discourage them from fighting a long-term war, which Japan could not afford to win. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor with the intent of destroying their fleet. Although the attack was successful, Japanese officials were afraid that American forces would be up and running within a few months. To conquer this, they planned to attack another strategic point.
Midway stood between the American West Coast and Japan. If Japan captured Midway, it would be a defensive position that the Americans would have to retake. The capture of Midway would be a significant threat for American forces in Pearl Harbor, where most of their fleet was located. Japan had taken Wake Island just a couple of months before. If they took Midway as well, they would have a free path for an invasion of Hawaii.
Japan has 4 aircraft carriers, 150 support ships, 15 submarines, and 248 aircraft. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers, 50 support ships, 8 submarines, and 233 aircraft. Japan's fleet had greater numbers and superior aircraft. It seemed a Japanese victory was imminent.
Part of Japan's plan in taking Midway was to force Americans to send reinforcements and give Japan's forces the perfect opportunity to destroy one of their aircraft carriers. The Americans, however, were one step ahead. American codebreaker Elvin Urquhart had broken the Japanese code a few months earlier. They were already expecting a fight, and they were ready for it. They placed their carriers in Midway prior to the battle, which allowed them to better prepare for their attack. Another key advantage the Americans had over the Japanese was radar. Radar was a very new technology invented by the British 6 years earlier. Only 6 months into the war, the Allies already started installing radar in warships. All 3 American carriers in Midway had radar detection systems, while the Japanese had none. All 4 of Japan's carriers relied solely on visual identification like binoculars and scout planes. This was an enormous advantage for the Americans. Radar allowed them to see the Japanese bombers from up to 100 miles away from every direction. On the other hand, the Japanese had only been able to identify enemy bombers when they were already approaching their ships.
Vice Admiral Nagumo and his team faced a difficult decision when news from a scout plane spotted enemy ships 200 miles away. Nagumo was afraid there might be enemy carriers there, so
He sent another reconnaissance plane to identify the threat level of the American forces.
upon returning, it reported that there were no aircraft carriers, only minor ships, and posed no threat to his fleet.
These were great news for Nagumo, since his fleet was now under attack by American bombers from Midway.
As the scout came back a third time, he was informed that there was in fact enemy carriers. Had he known this earlier, he would have been able to send bombers to destroy the carriers. Now, however, he was unable to do that because his own carriers were under attack. He now faces another difficult decision, whether to send his bombers to attack American carriers by themselves, or to recover his plane coming back from Midway and use them to aid the bombers. He decided to wait. This meant that the American fleet had the option to attack Japanese carriers unimpeded, destroying 3 of them, the Akaga, Kagi, and Soyu. Although the Hiryu made a counterattack and saw the sinking and evacuation of the USS Yorktown, it also met the same fate.
The Americans also suffered from miscommunication when attacking the enemy. Like the Japanese, an American scout plane unreliably reported that only 2 Japanese carriers were incoming, while there were 4. American intelligence reported that there would indeed be 4 or even 5 enemy carriers, instead of 2. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was leading the American forces, decided that the carrier USS Yorktown should search for the other suspected carriers, while the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet start the attack. That was the best move for him based on what evidence he had, since he could search for the suspected carriers while still in a position to assist his own carriers if necessary. But even so, this means that a third of the American forces were in reserve looking for the other Japanese carriers when they could be fighting them. Admiral Nimitz could have caused a larger impact on the enemy with 3 aircraft carriers attacking rather than only 2. If this simple miscommunication had not happened, there would be more American forces attacking Japan's ships at once, and even, perhaps, prevent the sinking of the USS Yorktown, which took 141 lives with it. Miscommunication was not all that affected the American forces, however. American airplanes also had well-thought-of strategies to depart Japanese fighters from American bombers. Every bomber would have the fighter following from above. If a Japanese airplane started pursuing, the fighters could switch behind them and would easily shoot them down. This tactic allowed them to destroy many of the superior Japanese aircraft while keeping their bombers alive long enough to hit Japan's carriers.
The Japanese had the help of greater numbers and better technology. The Americans had the help of a cracked code, good communication, and careful planning, which led them to a decisive victory. Japan lost all 4 of their aircraft carriers, while the Americans only lost 1 of 3. Nearly 300 Japanese planes were destroyed, while only 145 of the Americans were destroyed. In total, Japan lost 2,500 men, compared to the Americans who only lost 307. This defeat crippled the Japanese fleet, but they didn't have the resources to replace their losses. For every battleship the Japanese can build, the Americans can build 10 more.
Midway thrust the warlords back to their heels, causing their ambitious plans to be cancelled, and forced them an unexpected, unwelcome defensive role. Like what Samuel Morton stated, this defeat put the Japanese on the defensive and the Americans with the initiative.
With this loss, the Japanese wouldn't have the extra defensive position they were hoping for.
Their now crippled fleet left other Japanese occupied islands exposed to American attacks,
like Iwo Jima, which would be conquered 2 years later.
If the Japanese attack had been successful, many US carriers would have been destroyed, and Japan's fleet would have been able to invade Hawaii unimpeded and capture Pearl Harbor, leaving the US West Coast vulnerable.
The Japanese invasion would cause Americans to withdraw forces from Europe, making it easier for Axis forces to advance, taking millions of lives with it. This loss shows how communication can affect not only the outcome of a battle, but also the entire war.